Well, good evening, everybody. I'm Dr. Dan Stein, and Nicole invited me to be part of her healing space and provide information regarding medical cannabis, medical marijuana therapy. And tonight we're going to talk about how cannabis can help with anxiety and stress. Our last conversation was about pain, and our next conversation will be about insomnia. Cannabis therapy is great for lots of different reasons, and we thought that those three topics, pain, anxiety, and sleep, being the most common that patients come in complaining of, would be good to share with you. But there's a lot of other things, and if you go to my website, Neurology of Cannabis, that's our clinic name, Neurology of Cannabis. You can read there about other conditions that you may have questions about, or your family or neighbors might have questions about. Tonight we're going to focus on anxiety and stress. And I'll just start by giving you the answer. It's a spectrum. It may not be the spectrum, because oftentimes when we refer to the spectrum as if, oh, that young fellow's on the spectrum, we're talking about autism spectrum disorders. It's so common and talked about so often that we just refer to it as the spectrum. But there's a lot of things in neuroscience and behavior that are represented by a spectrum, and anxiety is one of those things. There's a spectrum of anxiety. And I'm hoping that when I'm done tonight, and there'll be time for questions, you'll all understand where you fall on the spectrum, and or where your loved ones and friends and neighbors might be on that anxiety spectrum if they're expressing concerns to you, or you observe things that are worrisome. The reason there's a spectrum of anxiety is because anxiety is an adaptive response. It's a form of reaction to environmental stimuli that is protective in a lot of ways. We have normal anxiety about running away from wild animals or finding food and shelter. That's in the Darwinian sense. But there's other normal anxiety. I had a little anxiety before coming down here tonight to talk to you. Normal, right? A little stage fright. That's okay. That's okay. But what if I had problems with palpitations and sweaty palms and shaky knees, and I wasn't able to, come up here and stand in front of you? That would be a little maladaptive. So that level of anxiety would be a little further down the spectrum, to the point where it's not appropriate or adaptive. It's limiting and maladaptive. And that's the key. That's the key. Is anxiety in your life a normal response, or is it not normal? And one of the ways that we determine that is if the level of anxiety prevents you from participating in life or at an event or in a situation. If you can't participate, if you are not functional, if you change your plan and avoid going with friends or being with family, if you change your lifestyle and you can't participate in things you want to because of anxiety, then it's on that end of the spectrum that's maladaptive and needs attention. Now, what kind of attention does anxiety require? Well, it depends, again, on the situation and the person. Sometimes you can self-medicate yourself with meditation or exercise, or just by talking to yourself or having a conversation with someone else. Oftentimes, anxiety that is not pathologic, that's not terrible, can be handled with these self-healing maneuvers. The cotton that I gave you all to smell before I came up has an essential oil aroma. Does anybody know what that aroma is, and can be? Anybody? Lavender. Lavender, thank you. You knew that, you were holding back. Lavender is one of those aromas that throughout history has been associated with a calming effect. Back in the day, I've been told grandmas used to use these lavender pillows for their family members. They used to make lavender pillows this big and give them out, and people that were anxious at night would sleep with these pillows on their eyes. Certainly, lavender as a form of aromatherapy is still being used because it has a calming effect. Now, it doesn't take a scientist to figure out why that is in order to use it, right? We've been using it for ages and it works. But for me, as a scientist, and I am a neuroscientist, it's helpful to understand in a biological way why lavender helps and how we can use it. Honestly, I didn't really care about lavender up until a couple of years ago. You know, I've been trained as a Western conventional medical doctor in neuroscience. I'm a neurologist, and I started practicing here in Sarasota in '93 after doing a fellowship at the National Institutes of Health where I did research on neuromuscular disease. I did my residency at the Cleveland Clinic. Everything in my educational experience was very conventional. There was no aromatherapy in my neuroscience class. Anxiety is a normal reaction to a fearful situation that allows us to adapt. But it can be maladaptive if it prevents you from participating in activities. There are many, many different kinds of anxiety on this spectrum. Everything from normal fear about driving in Sarasota in the wintertime to, you know, specific phobias like, you know, fear of public speaking or bridges or airplanes, to PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, which can be considered an extreme form of anxiety that's brought about by memories of traumatic events. These are all different forms of anxiety, and there's everything in the middle. So when we see patients in the clinic, the very first thing is to determine, of course, is it maladaptive or normal? Some people come in, they tell me a story about anxiety, and I'm like, okay, well, that's completely normal. You know, you just need to deal with that. You know, losing a little bit of sleep is fine. But if it's maladaptive and it's a consequence of childhood trauma or a specific avoidance behavior because of a specific phobia or something like PTSD, then of course we need to address that. And we address it with the least invasive treatment possible, like meditation and exercise, perhaps aromatherapy, or counseling. And then, if necessary, we can alter the biology with conventional pharmaceuticals like serotonin reuptake inhibitors, Paxil, Prozac, Celexa, Lexapro. Medications like that are effective for many patients with anxiety. Or other types of medications, cannabis, for example. Oftentimes, patients with problems having to do with anxiety that do need help beyond those types of more conservative therapies, the meditation and so forth, a lot of folks, they don't want to take serotonin agents anymore. There's potential side effects, and there is now a healthier, I believe, more natural approach, and that's by using cannabis, which is a form of plant medicine. Remember, cannabis is a plant that's been around way longer than we've been around. We know this because of fossil records, but when man showed up on the scene and started recording medical and industrial uses of cannabis 5,000 years ago in Central Asia, that plant became an integral part of civilization. And it was used initially for its industrial purposes. We know, many of you know as well, that hemp, which is a form of cannabis, can be used to make rope. The seeds are very helpful for nutritional purposes. And paper and so forth. Not the seeds, but the hemp stalk. And then, of course, over the next 1,000 or 2,000 years, the cannabis plant migrated along with people southward and over to India, where it was included in Ayurvedic medicines, and then eventually to Europe, and then across the pond to South and North America. And so this plant has been a part of our civilizations for thousands and thousands of years. It's extremely safe. We use it not only as a spiritual aid and as an industrial crop, and we can talk more about those things, but as a medication. And we're going to focus on that tonight. As a medication for anxiety that is maladaptive, cannabis works quite well. I would venture to say we have a success rate of greater than 90% in patients who come to the clinic with anxiety in whom we use cannabis therapy. Now, medical marijuana, or as I like to call it, medical cannabis, comes, bless you, it comes in different shapes and sizes. It comes as a plant that has a purplish hue to it. And that sort of purplish color on the bud is linalool. Linalool is a molecule called, it's in the group called terpenes, and linalool is one of those molecules in the plant, in that cannabis, in that weed, that gives it its aroma. Linalool is the terpene that's in lavender that you all were testing earlier. Terpenes are molecules that are aromatic and that are present in numerous different plants and fruits. But linalool is one of those molecules that we know historically produces a calming effect without sedation. That's a beautiful thing. You know, if you wanted to be calm and someone gave you a bunch of Valium or Xanax, you'd be calm, but you'd also be sedated. You'd be asleep. If you wanted to self-medicate with a martini, that's fine. You'd be calm, but you'd also be, you know, incoordinated, disinhibited, and perhaps a little bit yellow from your liver failure if you did a little too much. But linalool, or rather, yes, linalool has that calming effect without sedation. That is one of the terpenes in the cannabis plant. So I'm going to jump ahead and say that even though tetrahydrocannabinol, THC, is the active ingredient in cannabis that makes people high, as well as CBD, another active cannabinoid in the cannabis plant, these terpenes, these aromatic molecules, like linalool in lavender and certain cannabis plants, provides the more subtle biological and behavioral effects that we want to achieve in a given patient. So, okay, I'm willing to try cannabis for anxiety, Dr. Stein, but when I smoked it in college, I got anxious and paranoid. How is that going to help me now with my anxiety? Well, we have to make sure that there's a little linalool in the cannabis plant that we're going to recommend for you. We have to make sure that there's not too much THC, because tetrahydrocannabinol, THC, remember, that's the part that gets you high. If you take too much THC and you're not used to it, you're going to feel weird. And then your own fight or flight mechanism is going to kick in, and you're going to be anxious. You have to make sure that there's enough CBD, cannabidiol, in that cannabis plant to counteract the effects of the THC and produce a calming effect. So what we do in the clinic is provide a recommendation. We don't call it a prescription because of the DEA, and that's a whole nother ball of wax. But we provide a recommendation for the type of cannabis plant that has the right amounts of THC and CBD, those are the cannabinoids, as well as the terpenes, the aromatic molecules. And that's how we would treat a given patient with, let's say, no or low experience with cannabis, who had a bad experience before. We'll use a little bit of something along with the THC and CBD and linalool. So that's just to give you an idea of what happens in the clinic. Other patients who have anxiety, let's say, and can't fall asleep, their mind is going because they're anxious about, making their mortgage payment the next day, that's a different situation. We can use something a little more potent because they're going to be sleeping, and we can use cannabis therapy for that individual that can cause a little bit more sedation along with the relaxation so that they can sleep. And maybe instead of just puffing on a vape pen, they can do an edible, which will last 6 hours and help them throughout the night, as opposed to the person who's anxious during the day that needs less of an effect of sedation. They can't be sedated, they can't be impaired. So they'll take something, maybe a tincture or a small puff. So the design of the therapy for the anxious patient has a lot to do with what's causing the anxiety, what time of day they need medication, how long they need the effect for, and what their experience has been with cannabis. Because you build up a tolerance and a comfort level with cannabis if you have experience, and then we can adjust that therapy in a different way compared with someone who's cannabis naive. So I think that's kind of a broad overview that I wanted to share with you. Anxiety is a common condition. There's a spectrum of anxiety levels. Some are normal, some are dysfunctional, some are directed at specific triggers or phobias. Others are related to trauma or life events. And cannabis therapy is extremely useful for those individuals who have tried other things and failed, like meditation and exercise, or dealing with their anxiety-provoking stimulus. Someone could come in and say, well, my spouse, and I don't get along, and I'm very anxious about it, and I'm like, okay, well, maybe you need marriage counseling. Maybe it's another situation entirely that we need to handle at the cause, not just piling medications, whether it's cannabis or Prozac, on top of things. We always try to promote health and wellness through identifying the root cause of someone's anxiety. And of course, if you can do that, that's always the best way to handle things. But if you need these other types of interventions, going from a modest conservative treatment plan to something a little bit more aggressive, whether it's cannabis capsules or conventional psychological interventions, sure, we can do that too. But it's a spectrum, so I just want you to be on the lookout for that, and please feel free to call me or email me if you have any questions or concerns. We can talk about the practical aspects of how to get a cannabis card in Florida if you're interested in talking about that, or if you would like to talk about specific anxiety-related topics. So I'll stop there and take your questions.
Right.
So the question was, how does cannabis affect driving? And thank you for asking that. It's very important not to drive if you're new to cannabis therapy, because cannabis can affect your ability to concentrate. It can affect perception, and it can be dangerous to drive if you're new to cannabis therapy. If you are not new to cannabis therapy and you're comfortable using cannabis, then you have to use your own good judgment as to whether or not you're impaired or not. Because a lot of patients are able to drive with cannabis therapy as long as they're not impaired or intoxicated. And we have lots of patients that are being treated with very small amounts of THC, larger amounts of CBD, that need their medication during the day because, for example, they have generalized anxiety disorder, a free-floating anxiety that just creates problems for them every day in every way. And they need to be medicated all day long. So those individuals need a certain type of therapy that they can remain functional on. And that takes time. So the short answer is, if you're new to cannabis therapy, whenever we start therapy, we advise our patients not to drive. But then, after a certain period of time, you can drive, you can function, you can go to work and take your cannabis therapy. It's no more of a problem than something like opiates, where people are taking muscle relaxers or painkillers, or even they're alcoholics and they're drinking, and then they get into their car and drive. It's ridiculous. Cannabis therapy is the same type of thing. You have to be socially responsible and identify how you feel and what you're capable of before you get behind the wheel. Other questions?
Depending on the level, is it something that would be every day or every other day, or is it possible every other day or every 3 days?
Mm-hmm.
Does it need to be every day or?
So thank you. So depending on your level of anxiety and what situations provoke anxiety, cannabis therapy may be required all day or at certain times during the day or when certain situations are about to arise. So it can be individualized. I mentioned generalized anxiety disorder, which is a condition that requires constant therapy because the anxiety experience that can be disabling at times can occur at any time of day, triggered by any non-specific stimuli. So that's a generalized disorder. Whereas someone who has a specific phobia may only need cannabis therapy, let's say, when they're going to have Thanksgiving dinner with their family, or cross a bridge, or or be in a social situation if they have agoraphobia. They're uncomfortable in social situations. So we medicate patients depending on need. And that's one of the things we talk about when patients come into the clinic. What are their needs? What are their conditions? And then we come up with a treatment plan that allows relief at the right time, but without side effects. So that's the art. That's the art of it. The process to be qualified for medical marijuana card has to do with you or whoever coming into the clinic and providing me or another physician with medical records if available, and then a conversation that we would have about your condition or whoever's condition to make sure that they fall under one of the qualifying conditions. Every state that has medical marijuana approved, and that's 33 states in the union now, has certain criteria that those patients have to meet. So to qualify in Florida, you have to have one of 10 or so conditions. But there's room for interpretation. So for example, one of the conditions is post-traumatic stress disorder. And another one of the conditions is a condition like post-traumatic stress disorder. So if you have an anxiety condition that is similar to post-traumatic stress disorder, because that's also an anxiety condition. So there's about 10 or 12 different conditions, pain, Parkinson's disease, cancer, epilepsy, Crohn's disease, which is on the list, but for example, inflammatory or irritable bowel disease is not, but it's like Crohn's. So if you have a condition like one of the other conditions, you could qualify. Come to the office, we have a conversation, we qualify patients if appropriate, and then put in the registration online, and it takes about 10 days to get the approval from Tallahassee. So for patients who have not been in the medical system and don't have medical records, you could still qualify. You don't need to have those medical records. They're helpful. You don't need a referral from another physician to come to the cannabis clinic. You can come on your own with your own story. It doesn't have to be involved. It can just be you with your condition. And so we would sit down and have a conversation and decide what type of cannabis, how often, and so forth would be right for you. CBD is one of the parts of the cannabis plant, cannabidiol, one of the major cannabinoids that does not cause intoxication. But it does have effects on mood, and it can reduce anxiety. And so that's a beautiful thing. So you were able to find the amount of CBD from a reliable vendor, shout out to Nicole, and figure out how much you needed to reduce your symptoms. Fantastic. CBD is a fantastic drug, if I can call it that. It's a drug from a plant, right? And like foxglove, the plant produces digitalis, or bark from the willow tree produces aspirin. We have lots of drugs in everyday use that come from plants. CBD is wonderful for some patients with anxiety, and so that's great that you were able to figure that out. CBD is really good for lots of different things. It's great for epilepsy in kids. It's approved by the FDA. Imagine that. The FDA has approved a cannabis therapy in the form of Epidiolex for epilepsy in kids. CBD is useful as an anti-inflammatory pain reliever and to reduce anxiety, among other things. But it's not for everybody. And sometimes people will try CBD and they don't get to the right dose, so they give up prematurely. That's important. My father-in-law, I don't think I'd be breaking any HIPAA laws if I told you my father-in-law has rheumatoid arthritis, and I wanted him to try CBD because it works for rheumatoid patients. But most patients need to get between 50 and 100 milligrams a day of CBD or more, up to 200 milligrams a day, to get that anti-rheumatic effect. What if he just took 10, 20, 30, 40 and figured, forget about it, this is expensive, I'm not going to use it anymore? Then he would have not have given CBD a good enough trial because the dose wasn't high enough. So we're learning more about how to dose CBD. Sometimes you need a little bit of THC to amplify the CBD effect. You mentioned that's absolutely correct. And you can reduce the overall number of milligrams of CBD you need by using a small amount of THC. And this is one of the reasons why patients who fail CBD alone come into the clinic, we give them a little THC and we succeed. So when it comes to working with primary care doctors, I do not need patients to talk to their primary care doctor about their medical marijuana, but sometimes it's useful. So as I said earlier, you don't need a referral from your primary care doctor to come to the clinic, but when you do come to the clinic, I will take a medical history. I'll find out what medications you're taking because there may be some interaction with cannabis. For example, patients that are on the blood thinner called Coumadin or warfarin, or an antifungal agent called fluconazole have to be careful when they start cannabis therapy because it throws off the effect of the other pharmaceutical. So I take a history. If there's an issue that I need to bring in the primary care doctor, I'll pick up the phone and call them. Somebody who has a psychiatric illness, a bipolar disorder with severe manic episodes that are close to psychotic, I may pick up the phone and talk to that patient's psychiatrist to make sure we're on the same page because it takes a team, it takes a village, sometimes a village of doctors. That sounds awful. But yes, so I would get in touch with the other caregivers if it's necessary or appropriate, but it's often not necessary. Oftentimes, physicians will get upset or be uncertain about cannabis use in their patients. They want to know if it's safe or not. And I think more often than not, physicians trained in the United States are uncertain about cannabis therapy, and sometimes they're concerned to the point where they don't want their patients to be on it because they don't know about it. It was never taught in medical school. It's still not being taught in 90% of medical schools. And so because I have experience here in Sarasota and all the doctors know me, I encourage my patients to be forthright with their other physicians and share that information with them. And if they want to pick up the phone and call me, I'd be happy to have a conversation with them about the pros and cons and risks and benefits of cannabis therapy. I've been going to doctors' offices as part of our mission, which is to educate, we go to the doctor's offices and I meet with them and tell them about cannabis therapy, so that they feel comfortable sending their patients to me who want to get off opioids or Valium or Xanax. So we all have to learn, and I think that doctor that you're mentioning, that theoretical doctor that's concerned or doesn't want you to be on it, is concerned about you because they don't know enough about cannabis medicine. So they're coming from a place, of love for you, loving, caring, but it's also about fear and ignorance. And so we need to educate that physician, and so that's what we're trying to do. But I'm glad that you brought up that question, because we all need to have this conversation, not just with our physicians, but with our family members. There's a cannabis closet that's still full of people. You can't be so forthright about cannabis therapy with the majority of people in America, because Prohibition since 1937 has created a stigma that makes people friendly to cannabis sometimes seem like they're dope fiends or drug addicts, or
it's the gateway drug,
or
when
it's
in actuality it's the exit drug.
or it's exactly reefer madness. So all that is propaganda
Yes.
that has been perpetuated again and again, and is still being perpetuated by some what we call neo-prohibitionists. And so it is our job to get out there and educate the public. So yes, so share this information. Let people know that you've been here tonight, and that it's legitimate plant-based medication. And if they don't believe that, your concerned neighbors and family members, just have them call me, because everybody wants to know. It's amazing. Everybody has questions, whether it's the practical questions about how to qualify and so forth, or the biological or the risk type questions. Everybody has questions about cannabis. Is CBD enough? Do we need some THC? Can I drive? So yes, let's educate everyone. So if 33 states, 11 of which have adult use, and the others have just medical, the majority of individuals in the United States, well over 70%, approve of marijuana for medical use. Why doesn't our government, of the people, by the people, and for the people, change it from a Schedule I drug, like heroin and LSD, to descheduling it so that we can all use it properly to reduce our dependence on other pharmaceuticals? Well, the answer is because of money, politics, greed, and inertia.
Yes.
When cannabis was legal prior to the 1937 Tax Act, it was packaged by Eli Lilly as a remedy for migraines. It was available in cigarette form for young people with asthma because it's a bronchodilator. These things have been used as plant medicine for thousands of years, as well as in the United States, leading up until the early 20th century. It was only after Harry Anslinger and his team of merry men from the Drug Enforcement Agency of the time decided to exert their power and prevent something that sounded like it was imported from Mexico and call it marijuana, so that individuals wouldn't be using it that were self-medicating, that were going to jazz clubs in New Orleans, that were feeling good. No. Harry Anslinger, after alcohol prohibition, had a whole team of agents with little to nothing to do. So he and William Randolph Hearst, who was afraid of hemp-based paper taking over his thing, and the oil companies and the pharmaceutical companies all got together and said, oh, no. This kind and gentle, effective, and inexpensive plant has no place in our greedy socio-political environment. That's why. And then, after 37, came Nixon in the 60s, and the Controlled Substances Act, and the war on drugs. which has resulted in a disproportionate number of black and brown people being incarcerated now in privately owned prisons for profit and political social reasons. That's why. But don't get me started. Yes, thank you. That's our next event will be right here at the Wild Ginger Apothecary. We will be talking about cannabis therapy and sleep. Very, very important. And that date is January?
Thursday the 23rd.
Thursday, January 23rd, here at 6 p.m. There's three costs when it comes to cannabis therapy. The first cost is to the physician to do the qualification and the education and put the orders in. We charge $250 each year, and that includes the required visits, treatment plans, unlimited educations, and access for 12 months, $250.
For 12 months?
Yeah, 12 months, that's it. $75 goes to the state of Florida. That's the registration fee. That's also every 12 months.
Is that your card too?
Yeah, you get your card after you pay your $75.
$75, right.
And then the third cost is buying the medicine at the dispensary. You know, I don't touch the medicine. I don't sell the plant. Patients go to dispensaries, and there's 5 or 6 now in Sarasota, and you buy your medicine there, and depending on how much you need, that can cost anywhere from $50 to $150 a month. So for example, you get a tincture bottle that may cost $60, and you're using that to help reduce anxiety, that may last a month, for example. So it depends on how much you're using. Oh, the cost of cannabis therapy is not covered by insurance because the insurance companies are federally regulated. And since it's still not legal on a federal basis across the country, the insurance companies are not, they don't cover it. It's the same reason why it has to be cash pay, because the credit card companies and the banks are insured by the Federal Deposit Insurance,
Ever cash only?
FDIC, yeah. So, when the banking situation with cannabis commerce is difficult. We can't use conventional banking with cannabis therapy. It's basically cash pay. There is a bill in Congress that passed the House of Representatives. I think it's called SAFE, S-A-F-E, Banking Act, which will allow cannabis commerce in FDIC-insured banks. And that would be great because people that are in the cannabis industry need to take out loans to promote their business. Vets need to, take out loans. So we need banking reform to allow cannabis industry to prosper. And hopefully that will be passed in the Senate someday. Never in a million years. But I'm sorry, that was loud. Sorry, Brennan. Thank you. So it needs to be descheduled. Cannabis needs to be descheduled, and it will someday be descheduled, and it will be available for general consumption. And I believe that it will be regulated by the FDA at that point, because we need regulations. We need regulations on the products that people consume, whether it's a cabbage in the supermarket, a slab of beef, or a nutraceutical. We need regulations to make sure that the capsules that are being produced and sold are safe. Regulation is okay because we don't want people to be going to the black market and smoking vape cartridges that cause pulmonary disease. That's a byproduct of prohibition. So, don't get me started here. Yeah. The CBD products are available online in gas stations and health food stores, but those products do not contain any THC, the psychoactive ingredient, and they also don't contain much of any terpenes like linalool and pinene and limonene. So those CBD products are a money grab. They're not regulated. People are producing and selling products. Unlike what you get here, the products that are being sold everywhere, 70% of them do not contain what the label says it contains. There was a recent study, it was published in the Journal of the American Medical Association, that products that were bought online, 70% were mislabeled. And some of the products had THC in higher amounts. And then there was another study recently that also looked at widely available CBD unregulated products, and some of them had no CBD at all in them. So there you go. So get your CBD from a reliable vendor.
Look for lab tests.
Look for lab tests, certificate of analysis, the COA, and seek advice. Seek advice. You can call or reach out to me by email, info@neurologyofcannabis.com, or you can call me. My card is there. I'd be happy to talk. Talk to people. I answer all emails, no charge, and find out more and spread the good word, okay?
Where's your office at?
Our office is right behind Clark and Sawyer Road. So Clark and Sawyer right up here, where there's a little plaza right behind the shopping area there. Just a stone's throw from here. Well, thank you. Good night. Thanks, Nicole. Thank you very much. Thank you.